So I'm super excited to be bringing on Natalia Hearn from Crypto Chicks onto the debate today, and she's going to tell you a little bit about Crypto Chicks before we start.
So I got pulled into this last minute because I'm not Lucia Gallardo, as you can see, Natalia Hearn. So I'm really happy that I'm here, and TKS is kind of an amazing organization, and our organization, Crypto Chicks, is focused on education and blockchain, understanding what blockchain means to a society, both from the crypto side and kind of the philosophical aspect of what this all means. And we were focused on women because mostly in this sector we're dealing with young men who are developers. So we wanted to expand that understanding, and now we're also working with high schools. So we're trying to um, expand the horizon and not uh, just focus on women, but focus on the next generation, because this is next generation technology.
Yeah, for sure. So today, the topic that we're going to be talking a little bit about is we want to extrapolate into 10 years, 20 years, 15 years into the future when blockchain does become the underlying protocol for the most of our online interactions. And we want to take a look at how that will affect different fields and what the world will look like when all of our online and social interactions become decentralized, when we take out the middleman from all of these transactional types of interactions. So I guess just to start off, for those of you who don't know, blockchain is essentially a distributed ledger database, and it means that there is no one single point of failure, which makes it a very secure kind of system in which people can share data. And what makes it so special is that it is able to take out the middleman from any kind of interaction. And so right now, for example, with Bitcoin, when you have a transaction, it doesn't go through any intermediary banks the way it would if you're doing like a e-transfer through a bank. And so what makes that so interesting is that now we have these protocols where we can actually try out different kinds of economic models, and for the very first time we're able to really see what it's like to have a fully decentralized system. And so one of the things that are interesting about this is that when we look at blockchain, um, the thing that creates, the mechanism that creates and introduces more of the currency into the system is mining, right? And mining is basically a bunch of computers that are called miners, and they try to break a computational puzzle in order to verify a transaction and to make sure that it's secure. And so the issue with this is that there are corporations and groups of miners that end up aggregating all of their mining power. And so that group of miners ends up becoming like 40% of the whole mining power or hashing power of the entire blockchain. And so that kind of begs the question to take a look at, we have 40% of one centralized group that is currently creating new currency, new bitcoins into circulation, and how is that affecting the actual decentralization of this network? Is it still truly decentralized? And so what are some of your thoughts on this?
I think if we're talking about Bitcoin in particular, the fact that initially the way the structure was set up is that given the fact that we already mined 18 million, 16 million coins, we're somewhere around there out of 22. So you're not going to have a sort of a 51 kind of percent, attack at this point, and the rest are distributed globally. If we talk about other coins, then absolutely that's an issue, and that's also an issue in if you want to look and as an investment, and then you really have to rely on the people who are running the other companies in the blockchain sector that do have tokens, and that becomes on an individual basis. Then you have to evaluate, your agreement, like with anything else, is as good as your handshake. If the people with whom you're shaking hands are solid, then that's going to go a long way. If it isn't, it's no lawyer is going to be able to resurrect that.
Yeah, for sure. I think something interesting is that when it comes to the application side of things, um, when we're creating services that are decentralized as compared to, like, for example, banking services that are centralized, there actually ends up being quite a lot of catches in a system where ultimately the responsibility for the amount of currency that you hold falls back on you, and you don't have anyone that you can go to in case something goes wrong, right? So for example, if you're dealing with a bank and you submit a transaction by accident, you can always get that centralized service to contact them and have them reverse that transaction. But since a blockchain is immutable, it's unchangeable, that's just simply not possible, right? One more interesting thing is that because it's so decentralized, so much of the responsibility just falls back on the individual. And the reason why centralized services exist is to make things easier for people, right? And so when the responsibility all falls back onto one person, that makes it so much harder to, for example, like organize and manage all of your funds. So there's been so many cases of people who have stored like Bitcoin in like hard drives, and then afterwards the hard drive was lost or damaged, and that portion of the overarching circulating supply of bitcoins is now lost forever, right? And certainly like right now that fraction is still pretty small, but when we do end up coming to a time when we achieve mass adoption and when literally everyone in the world is transacting using cryptocurrencies, that will definitely become an issue, right?
Well, it's interesting because we have two parts to that. One is, yes, it's hard for us in anything to take full responsibility. So it's not just cryptocurrency or Bitcoin. Um, the other part of it, look, if you have a wallet full of money and you lose it, we're used to that. How many people have you known have lost their wallet, right? So before we had credit cards, now kind of it's reversible with credit cards because you can cancel it. But if you had $100 in there, that $100 is lost. So that's really no different than having an electronic wallet that you got to sort of take care of it. So that's, if you start talking about larger sums of money, then, then it becomes a stress point in terms of how we deal with it. In terms of mass adoption, again, it's what are you using? Is it on daily transactions? Like if you look at M-Peso in Kenya, right? That's used on daily transactions, and people are not worried about losing that or not. In terms of centralized, you can have, centralization. You can have a benevolent dictatorship, which would probably what we would call our banks, right? They kind of help us live. And we may not have benevolent dictators where you have, Venezuela crisis, or, look at Argentina. There's lots of countries around the world where the dictatorship sort of eats itself, and including the people that it's supposed to dictate, right? So it's, we're going through this kind of interesting phase, and I think we've had always historically, the one thing is that as blockchainers, you have this revolution in technology, so you think you can reinvent all the wheels. A lot of wheels have already existed, and we can look at history as a really good way to realizing what can we do as a humanity, because fundamental aspects of how we operate have not changed since Stone Ages.
Yeah, definitely. Like you see this especially in developing countries where the population ends up like froggy jumping over certain technologies, right? Like they go straight into using the smartphone. And like it's interesting because they have like iPhones when they don't actually have like working toilets and things like that, right? And so like blockchain definitely has a place in countries and in societies where the infrastructure is brittle and where there's not a deep enough kind of fundamental structure, like social structure, financial structure, economical structure set in place. And that's where blockchain ends up coming in, right? And in developed countries or in countries where all of this infrastructure is already set in place, when a government has its roots for like tens of years, like hundreds of years, that's very difficult to implement and use blockchain to like disrupt the entire social system, right? And so I guess ultimately it does come down to a point of um, like in what kind of situations does the decentralized nature of blockchain actually is actually needed? Like when is there actually a demand for that decentralization where when centralized services can offer certain things to people and make their lives so much easier, and work in complement with these already existing infrastructures. Um, but there was something interesting. I was doing some research in game theory, and there is a concept in game theory called the Schelling point. And essentially, what it means is that humans have a tendency to kind of converge and focalize into one like central point, no matter what situation it is, because they want to achieve a sort of common ground with other people. So I don't think we're far along enough yet to be able to create like an actual like situation where we can really like visualize this and see this happening. But I think it would be like an interesting thought experiment. Like, are humans really naturally, predisposed into looking in towards like one centralized group and having, that graph where everyone is just pointing towards that one center point, or will we actually be able to exist well in a decentralized or distributed society?
Well, I think it's interesting, because we talk about, blockchain or crypto community. So we come back to this word community all the time, and the community has this common element, right? Decentralizations has these like dots all over the place that are kind of not related. At the end of the day, I think humans, we do have this community component, and I think the for me, what blockchain brings is a level of trust without borders. While that's kind of, I think, in human history, those two things never really went together because your trust was associated with borders, personal borders, borders of your community, and borders of your society. And this is what I think we're fighting today on a political scale about building walls or not building walls. And at the end of the day, we are talking about community and how does that work. This allows you the trust that a transaction that was done here is exactly the same transaction across the globe, right? And it's interesting how we've changed our history or recording of our history. Every country has changed that history or went through the change of the history because that perception, and Canada including, and we're not, we're still going through those, same thing. Google is having issues of going to China because they may have to modify how Tiananmen Square was recorded. Are we going to use the North American version, or are we going to use the current Chinese version, right? Those are the things that, long term, blockchain, the recording of information can provide. There's kind of some reference of what actually happened, right? So, again, this is really philosophical questions, and it's, initially when you asked me to come on the panel, and I said I'm going to be talking about decentralization, and you have to have a discussion about why, centralized something is important. I was born in Soviet Union, so for me, everything to do with centralization was like a real problem, and I left when I was a kid, and so anytime there's a word of centralization, it doesn't have necessarily good connotations for me. However, most of the globe operates in centralized, so that there's a reason for that. Maybe we're talking about the genetics from the previous talk. Maybe that's something that we need to look deeper into, in terms of how societies operate. And again, coming back to the sense of community, I think as humans we need community. We cannot be these individual sort of stars in the sky that are disconnected. We need that sense of belonging and connection.
Yeah, definitely. But so we're about to wrap up now, but I think definitely I like the point that you brought up about how like the way data is collected will definitely change, and I think that's like one thing that is definite. In so like we're kind of living in an era right now where data is the singular most like powerful resource that we have, right? And especially when it comes to like analytics and using machine learning and things like that, and like if blockchain were ever to be able to become like the main foundational protocol, types of protocols, I think it would be so fundamentally jarring, and it would change so much the way that data is collected, and it would change a lot like the business models of many of the centralized platforms that exist right now today, because right now a lot of big corporations, their main business model is data, right? Their main product is data, data from us, from their users. And when it comes to blockchain, blockchain is very fundamentally like securing data, right? And making it so that it can't be tampered or altered very easily. And definitely there's been like ideas of creating some sort of data marketplace enabled through distributed ledger technologies that's been floating around. But it would be interesting to think about how implementation of blockchain would alter, you know, the way that we collect data and the way businesses eventually use data, and how that will affect like progress in machine learning. So a pretty interesting intersection to think about. But yeah, for sure.
You mean decentralized currency? Yeah, okay.
Um, I think it would be, so if we like look far, far into the future and like kind of like really extrapolate this into like sort of a more like a thought experiment type thing, it would be really cool because the way cryptocurrency works is so different from the way fiat works, because fiat is like totally controlled by like the central government, right? So it would be interesting because cryptocurrency is so borderless, and because it would have the same value across like all borders. It's not like geographically limited. Like if these kind of systems were to be implemented into the world on like a global scale, we would literally come into this kind of state where we would have one sort of whole network of people, of decentralized people without any overarching government. And so like what counts as governance would actually end up being smart contracts that automate these sorts of interactions between people, and smart contracts that automate the movement of value from like business person to, from business to like client, and that would actually automate like things like voting, like policies, and I think the very unflexible and unhuman aspect of that seems a little daunting. But I think that ultimately, I don't think there would be a way to have that be compatible with the current systems that we live in
Yeah,
right
I
now.
mean, it's absolutely true. We have legacy systems. To answer your question, then we have to completely move away from the whole aspect of currency. And your value actually becomes as a you as an energy and economic unit, and your talents within you, and those talents could be whatever. And not that's the ledger. Ledger is of you. It's not of accumulation. So you have to completely rethink of, because we are brought up to accumulate wealth. That's part of how our education, our socioeconomic global system works, right? And so we got to completely erase that and say you're born with certain talents, and you contribute during your 100 maybe 200 years if the genome starts working properly, right? And that's your imprint on the society, and you keep and there's a ledger of your existence and your contributions, right? So then, yeah, that's where the blockchain can, because that's a ledger of truth, and there's no accumulation. So start thinking of society in that way.
Are there any other questions? Here, yeah, go ahead.
Doesn't that sound almost communistic in a sense? Like everyone in the idea of communism, right? Like not communism is how it's employed today, but communism in the way that it was described back during the philosophers were creating it, in the sense that everyone's working just because they have skills and talents, and there's no real sense of earning. It's just a sense of being.
Well, yeah, earning is why do we earn? Because I mean, we have this thing of being happy eventually when we earn a certain amount. What about being happy on what you do on daily basis? So that's one part. It is a philosophical question. And then, absolutely, honestly, if we actually distill pure socialism and pure capitalism, they actually connect. And you know what they connect on? That there is completely no centralized government in both. Which is, if you actually go to Marxism and sort of the initial, protocols and capitalist initial protocols, government doesn't exist in both of those systems. So it's kind of interesting.
If I could add on to that, I think, like I mentioned before, like the part that's really exciting about blockchain protocols is the fact that you can actually try out different economic models and actually have them be functional. And like what's really cool about that, there's this concept called universal basic income, right? And there's the idea that if you give everyone the resources to be able to live for free, like they would become lazy and ultimately they would not add any value to society. But I think that would actually be such a great platform to building like a true meritocracy, where the real merit of people and their real value in society is ultimately determined by their own aspirations and their own ambitions. And I think that would be a really compatible vision with distributed ledger networks. Yes.
Well, the thing is that as a country that's kind of on the outskirts of economic powers, you're not ever gonna be able to compete with U.S. dollars. So you gotta start looking outside of the box, because the box is U.S. dollars today globally. Oil is traded in U.S. dollars. I mean, if you all the gold is traded in U.S. dollars. So this is why maybe this is a solution for the current outliers.
I also think that's kind of the very basis of why cryptocurrencies exist, right? Like cryptocurrencies are like fundamentally borderless, and they're not constrained by any kind of political or geographical borders. And I think like it's for reasons that you said, that like it's why cryptocurrency was invented. It was like to address these issues and to bypass those political restraints, to allow people to like exchange value in a way that is fair for everyone and trustless. Any other questions? Awesome. All right, thank you so much. This was really awesome.
Thank you. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you.